to ruin his relationship with his wife, Nicola, and that his mom humiliated him at his wedding.
Brooklyn and Nicola are both complete spoiled brats.
The House of Beckham story has started to track slightly with the sort of House of Windsor story.
Children are allowed to make mistakes. That's how they learn.
The parents are negligent, they're abusive to their children. That is not what's happening here.
Nicola, her father's a billionaire, so he no longer needs the Beckham money anymore.
He's a poor photographer of elephants.
You know, bless him, I don't think he's the brightest.
He's speaking out for the first time. He says that his parents have repeatedly tried to ruin his relationship with his wife, Nicola, and that his mom humiliated him at his wedding by dancing inappropriately with him.
I'll put out a statement saying we absolutely adore our son and we always will do and we'll always be waiting for him.
Behind the flawless photos and controlled smiles of the Beckham family, tension has been quietly building, Brooklyn Beckham caught between loyalty and escape. Nicola Peltz offering a different world, David Beckham protecting legacy, Victoria Beckham protecting influence. What looks like harmony hides negotiation, what feels like love hides pressure, a wedding moment becomes emotional evidence, a son begins rewriting his place inside a global brand, and when fame mixes with family, the damage never starts publicly.
Brooklyn and Nicola are both complete spoiled brats. To turn on your parents publicly is a reflection of you and your character, and if I were Nicola, I'd be embarrassed by my husband who's acting like a little boy, a child, putting out this ridiculous statement.
I have been silent for years and made every effort to keep these matters private. Unfortunately, my parents and their team have continued to go to the press, leaving me with no choice but to speak for myself and tell the truth about only some of the lies that have been printed. I do not want to reconcile with my family. I'm not being controlled. I'm standing up for myself for the first time in my life, for my entire life.
Instead of his wife,
My parents have controlled narratives in the press about our family.
She must have been.
The performative social media posts, family events, and inauthentic relationships have been a fixture of the life I was born into. Recently, I have seen with my own eyes the lengths that they'll go through to place countless lies in the media. It's mostly at the expense of innocent people to preserve their own facade. But I believe the truth always comes out.
Brooklyn was summoned to the stage where Victoria was waiting and she danced inappropriately on him, whatever that may mean. Nicola ran out crying and...
It starts privately, emotionally, and then slowly leaks into the open. Something inside the Beckham household is no longer aligned, and the unraveling has already begun. Brooklyn Beckham grew up inside a spotlight that never turned off. Cameras at school gates, headlines before adulthood, David Beckham building discipline into every movement, Victoria Beckham shaping image into identity, and Brooklyn Beckham learning early that being a Beckham was never just about family. It was about performance. Every dinner felt like positioning, every holiday felt like presentation, every emotion carried consequence. And from a young age, Brooklyn Beckham understood that love inside the Beckham world came with structure, visibility.
They make mistakes. Children are allowed to make mistakes. That's how they learn. So that's what I try to teach my kids. But you have to sometimes let them make those mistakes.
Why I'm always.
And expectation. As the eldest son, Brooklyn Beckham carried pressure before purpose, expected to. Led, expected to succeed, expected to match a reputation he never chose, and inherited greatness creates comparison before creation. Leaving Brooklyn Beckham watched before he was ready to decide who he actually was. Photography, cooking, modeling, business experiments. Every move Brooklyn Beckham made became public evaluation, online laughter, headlines about nepotism, comments questioning legitimacy, and even when he smiled, insecurity stayed.
Similarities drawn between Harry and Meghan's unceremonious departure from The Crown and now the Brooklyn Beckham breakup.
Underneath, David Beckham believes structure equals protection, keeping the family unified, close, aligned, because the Beckham name is not personal, it is global, commercial, emotional, and political. And David Beckham protects that shape instinctively. Victoria Beckham believes motherhood means presence, guidance, involvement, never fully releasing control, and for years Brooklyn Beckham accepted that rhythm, living as son before living as man. Then Nicola Peltz entered. Nicola Peltz did not grow up inside the Beckham system. She grew up wealthy, shielded, emotionally direct, and independent, and when Nicola Peltz connected with Brooklyn Beckham, the relationship became more than romance. It became psychological safety. With Nicola Peltz, Brooklyn Beckham felt seen as a person instead of a brand extension, not a project, not a legacy carrier, but simply Brooklyn.
But in Meghan's case, she knew the serious demands of the royal family. That's a 1,100-year institution. She obviously knew what she was signing up for and did not uphold her end of the contract.
And when someone finally feels emotionally safe, they begin questioning what they were surviving before. Brooklyn Beckham started leaning into marriage not only as love, but as escape. Escape from expectation, escape from family gravity, escape from living inside David Beckham's shadow and Victoria Beckham control. But families built on closeness struggle when closeness becomes influence. Wedding planning exposed that tension. Every decision carried symbolism. Fashion, hierarchy, timing, voice, leadership, and inside the glamour, Brooklyn Beckham and Nicola Peltz were negotiating adulthood. While David Beckham and Victoria Beckham were unconsciously preserving authority, to Victoria Beckham, involvement feels like care, but to Nicola Peltz, involvement feels like ownership. To David Beckham, unity protects the brand, but to Brooklyn Beckham, unity begins suffocating individuality. Those realities cannot coexist peacefully forever.
Brooklyn, in his case, this is just tainting the business brand, the Beckham family, and he's allowed to do that.
At the wedding, cameras saw perfection, but Brooklyn Beckham remembers discomfort, emotional imbalance, moments that never healed, and memory layered with pressure instead of celebration. After marriage, Brooklyn Beckham did not leave loudly. He left psychologically. He spent more time inside Nicola Peltz's world, her family, her atmosphere, her independence, and slowly the Beckham orbit felt heavier online. Pressure continued, jokes about Brooklyn Beckham careers, memes questioning worth, criticism about privilege, and each comment reinforced insecurity Nicola Peltz tried to protect him from, so loyalty started shifting.
Brooklyn Beckham has benefited from a huge amount of nepotism, which I know is an ugly word, but he would be nothing if not for his famous footballer dad and his posh Spice Girl mom.
Not because Brooklyn Beckham stopped loving David Beckham and Victoria Beckham, but because Brooklyn Beckham started defining himself differently. David Beckham still expected closeness, gatherings, public unity, while Brooklyn Beckham started craving boundaries. Victoria Beckham still guided with maternal authority, while Brooklyn Beckham began feeling that protection was becoming presence he could not escape. So the family dynamic changed quietly, smiles stayed public, but emotional distance widened privately. Brooklyn Beckham stood between two identities, Beckham's son and Peltz's husband, and the space between those roles kept stretching because marriage rewrites.
He wouldn't have his amateur cooking channel, he wouldn't have his modeling career, so I think a little bit more gratitude is due.
Loyalty, and when loyalty rewrites identity, families fracture before anyone admits it. Brooklyn Beckham stopped reacting to moments and started reinterpreting history, replaying memories, assigning meaning to things that once felt normal. What once felt like warmth began feeling like power. What once felt like guidance began feeling like control. What once felt like belonging began feeling conditional, and that emotional shift is dangerous. Because when family stops feeling like home and starts feeling like pressure, every action becomes symbolic, every dance becomes territorial, every hug becomes strategic, every smile becomes layered. The Beckham family still looked united on the outside.
The parents are negligent or they're abusive to their children. That is not what's happening here. An overbearing, devouring mother, that's a common trope. Everyone has that experience, I think, with the mother-in-law.
But inside, Brooklyn Beckham was already emotionally relocating, and the public had no idea how close he was to finally speaking, because silence inside famous families never disappears. It only builds until release becomes unavoidable. After the wedding glow faded, Brooklyn Beckham did not return to the same emotional position inside the family. Something had shifted, not publicly, not dramatically, but internally, a quiet recalibration of loyalty, identity, and distance. Brooklyn Beckham and Nicola Peltz settled into married life. But marriage for Brooklyn Beckham was not only partnership, it was separation from childhood.
On Monday evening, Brooklyn Beckham took to his Instagram to break a silence, in his eyes. He unleashed a long diatribe against his parents, David and Victoria Beckham.
Patterns, separation from parental gravity, separation from living as an extension of David Beckham and Victoria Beckham inside the Beckham household. Closeness had always meant visibility. Shared schedules, shared appearances, shared narratives, But Nicola Peltz came from a world where privacy meant power, and Brooklyn Beckham began absorbing that philosophy. With Nicola Peltz, Brooklyn Beckham learned that love does not require constant access, that family does not mean permanent availability, and that adulthood sometimes begins with distance. That idea quietly collided with David Beckham expectations. David Beckham still saw family as a unit, birthdays together, campaigns together, dinners together, public alignment, emotional consistency.
He's a poor photographer of elephants, he's a cook, he's an actor/model. His younger brothers just seem slightly more well-adjusted.
And when Brooklyn Beckham started missing gatherings, delaying responses, and choosing Nicola Peltz environment over Beckham tradition, the absence felt symbolic. Victoria Beckham noticed first. Victoria Beckham is attentive to emotional shifts. She watches patterns, timing, tone, body language. And she could sense that Brooklyn Beckham was no longer orbiting naturally, he was drifting intentionally to Victoria Beckham. Drifting feels like rejection. She had invested years into shaping family unity.
Victoria Beckham pulled the rug out from underneath Nicola with a wedding dress at the 11th hour. But in Vogue, she talks about working with Valentino for an entire year on a custom gown that she wore down the aisle, including 2 trips to headquarters in Rome. So I think this is a bunch of baloney.
And suddenly her eldest son was rewriting proximity. Brooklyn Beckham felt the tension, but he did not confront it, he internalized it. Instead of arguing, Brooklyn Beckham began compartmentalizing. Separating worlds, Nicola Peltz world and Beckham world. And the space between those environments started growing wider. Nicola Peltz did not push Brooklyn Beckham away from his parents directly, but she did offer emotional insulation, safety from judgment, safety from brand pressure, safety from public ridicule. When Brooklyn Beckham felt criticized online, Nicola Peltz defended him. When Brooklyn Beckham felt directionless, Nicola Peltz validated exploration.
Came to the stories of David Beckham's affair, or even affairs, if you believe all the reports, which they've never legally challenged.
When Brooklyn Beckham felt small inside a giant surname, Nicola Peltz reminded him he was already enough. That emotional reinforcement subtly shifted Brooklyn Beckham loyalty center. David Beckham still believed discipline creates stability, that structure prevents collapse, that unity preserves legacy. And when Brooklyn Beckham resisted that rhythm, David Beckham interpreted it as emotional distance rather than growth, so conversations changed tone. They became shorter, careful, cautious, layered with unsaid meaning. Family interactions stopped feeling automatic and started feeling negotiated.
Beautiful wedding, and as a mother, to see my son so happy means so much.
Brooklyn Beckham sensed that every choice he made was now interpreted, not just felt. If he skipped a dinner, it became a message. If he posted with Nicola Peltz family, it became alignment. If he stayed silent online during Beckham moments, it became separation. And inside famous families, symbolism replaces honesty. Nicola Peltz also began noticing discomfort. At gatherings, body language shifted. Pauses lasted longer. Laughter felt strategic. And Nicola Peltz could feel that she was being assessed, not welcomed to Victoria Beckham. Presence equals involvement to Nicola Peltz. Presence equals autonomy. Those philosophies clash quietly before they clash loudly. Brooklyn Beckham felt trapped between protecting his marriage and preserving his parents' emotional security, because marriage rewrites allegiance, but parents still expect priority.
Nicola, her father's a billionaire, so he no longer needs the Beckham money anymore, and he's like, I've got this hot young wife,
and she doesn't
I don't
need it
feel
either.
obligated to do this.
Brooklyn Beckham started carrying invisible guilt. Guilt for choosing Nicola Peltz, guilt for disappointing David Beckham, guilt for feeling relief when he stayed away. That emotional contradiction creates fracture. The public still saw smiles, coordinated outfits, birthday posts, but inside the family, communication became filtered, curated, cautious. Brooklyn Beckham began measuring what he shared. Not because he wanted secrecy, but because honesty felt dangerous. David Beckham still asked questions, still tried to pull Brooklyn Beckham closer, still believed proximity. Solves distance, Victoria Beckham still guided, still commented, still suggested, still mothered, but Brooklyn Beckham no longer experienced that as comfort, he experienced it as pressure. So resistance grew quietly. Not rebellion, but withdrawal. Not confrontation, but repositioning. Brooklyn Beckham started redefining home not as where he came from.
Is that Brooklyn?
Yeah, Brooklyn. He's
Wow.
yeah, no, he's the first one.
But as where he felt emotionally unobserved, and that place increasingly existed with Nicola. Peltz, families fracture when silence replaces curiosity, when assumptions replace conversation, when loyalty feels tested instead of trusted. Brooklyn Beckham and David Beckham were no longer speaking as father and son, they were speaking as representatives of different emotional systems. One built on unity and control, the other built on independence and protection, and the distance between those systems kept stretching because once someone emotionally relocates, returning becomes psychologically harder. Brooklyn Beckham was not running from his family. He was running toward a version of himself he never had space to become. But every step forward for Brooklyn Beckham felt like a step away from David Beckham and Victoria Beckham. And the public still had no idea how fragile the situation had become.
Brooklyn and his wife, clearly Nicola Peltz, clearly do regard themselves as having been the victim of terrible briefings. They have not been silent themselves in that department.
Because the most dangerous conflicts are the ones that look calm on the surface. Until something finally forces the truth into the open, Brooklyn Beckham's withdrawal was not just physical, it was emotional. A slow unraveling that neither David Beckham nor Victoria Beckham fully anticipated. He had always been the eldest, the first to carry the family name into adulthood, the first to experience the glare of fame. And now he was quietly claiming autonomy in a way that unsettled everything. Nicola Peltz became both anchor and shield. She softened the exposure. She protected Brooklyn Beckham from judgment, from parental critique, from public scrutiny. And in doing so, she created an invisible barrier between Brooklyn Beckham and the Beckham household.
The Beckhams will have thought that it would have been their son's bride signing the prenuptial. And in the end, it was the other way around.
David Beckham noticed the subtle shifts, the way Brooklyn Beckham hesitated before joining family meals, the way his laughter no longer carried the same warmth, the way his eyes flickered toward Nicola Peltz when seeking reassurance. Victoria Beckham felt it too, a tightening in her chest every time she saw Brooklyn Beckham retreat into his own space. She had always prided herself on reading emotional cues, but now even she struggled to interpret what loyalty meant in this new phase of her son's life. At the heart of the tension was control, not in a villainous sense, but as a force of habit.
Not asking your future mother-in-law to design your dress, but I'm finding this quite confusing because Nicola Peltz wore Valentino on her wedding day. According to Brooklyn's account, Victoria Beckham was going to make Nicola's dress, but she pulled out on the 11th hour.
David Beckham and Victoria Beckham had spent decades shaping the family's rhythm, orchestrating appearances, protecting their image, guiding careers, and they were unprepared for a son who no longer conformed to that structure. Brooklyn Beckham felt torn between honoring his parents and asserting his independence, torn between public expectation and private desire, torn between a family brand that demanded loyalty and a marriage that demanded devotion. Every decision became a negotiation, not a conversation, each interaction layered with unspoken consequences, and small moments escalated quietly into emotional friction. The family's public image remained impeccable.
The House of Beckham story has started to track slightly with the sort of House of Windsor story. I don't know if these kind of weird royal families and whether you can escape this torment.
Staged photos, coordinated outfits, celebratory posts. Yet behind the camera, the air was thick with hesitation, with restrained emotion, with questions that could not be safely asked. Brooklyn Beckham's social media posts began to tell a different story, curated glimpses into life with Nicola Peltz, moments of intimacy, joy, and laughter that subtly contrasted with the poised, polished Beckham brand. To David Beckham, these posts were signals.
You know, bless him, I don't think he's the brightest, and I mean no shade, but he isn't. And it's quite difficult if you've been raised entirely in that way of living.
Evidence that Brooklyn Beckham's priorities had shifted. Evidence that the bond of tradition was loosening. Victoria Beckham interpreted them differently, wondering if her guidance was being rejected, if her influence was fading, if the son she had raised to navigate fame with grace was now navigating it on his own terms. Brooklyn Beckham's siblings observed silently. Romeo and Cruz watched the subtle tension. Absorbing lessons about loyalty, independence, and the weight of public expectation, Brooklyn Beckham's position as eldest added pressure because in celebrity families, the firstborn often sets the template. And any deviation is magnified. Nicola Peltz noticed the strain too, seeing moments of unspoken.
Many parents will be thinking they clearly absolutely love their children, and they've done everything they can for them, and they've done their best, which is what most people do.
Conflict, hearing pauses where conversation should have flowed. Witnessing how Brooklyn Beckham's guilt and love intertwined into a complicated pattern, it was not rebellion, it was not malice, it was identity. Brooklyn Beckham was discovering the limits of his family's emotional architecture, testing boundaries, exploring autonomy, trying to reconcile the man he was becoming with the son he had always been. David Beckham and Victoria Beckham responded with care, but also with concern, each action measured, each word deliberate, each expression carefully guarded. The tension was compounded by the public eye, every minor disagreement potentially magnified into gossip.
Nicola had asked Victoria Beckham to take in some displaced dogs in the LA wildfires.
To help her with displaced
refused.
dogs.
I mean, that felt like quite a low blow.
Every social media post potentially a headline, every family gathering potentially a viral moment. Brooklyn Beckham felt the scrutiny acutely, his private struggles becoming fodder for speculation, his personal choices dissected, his mistakes amplified, and in response, he leaned more on Nicola Peltz, more on distance, more on selective transparency. The emotional fractures deepened silently, layered with guilt, love, expectation, and fear. Every interaction now carried weight. Every glance, every word, every post became a subtle negotiation, a careful test of boundaries. Brooklyn Beckham's struggle was not only about independence, it was about identity. Negotiating selfhood within a family that had long defined him publicly, David Beckham and Victoria Beckham were learning that guidance has limits. That influence cannot substitute for choice, that parental intention can clash with adult autonomy, the balance between love and control, loyalty and freedom, tradition and change, began to tilt precariously, and yet neither side could retreat completely because the family bond, history, and shared legacy held them together, even as it threatened to pull them apart. Brooklyn Beckham's next choices would test the family's limits.
We started talking at a party, and that's kind of when we kind of,
Yeah.
That's when I fell in love with you.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That was all factual.
Yeah.
Expose emotional vulnerabilities and reveal whether reconciliation or further fracture awaited, and as the quiet tension simmered, the question remained. How long could a family maintain appearances when the fractures inside were growing too visible to ignore the tension between Brooklyn Beckham and the Beckham? Parents escalated quietly at first, subtle glances and pauses that seemed innocuous to outsiders, but to those who lived it, each moment was charged with unspoken frustration. David Beckham felt the weight of legacy pressing down. He had built a life of public admiration, a family image of perfection. And yet Brooklyn Beckham's growing independence threatened the structure he had carefully maintained. Victoria Beckham experienced it differently. The anxiety of watching a son she had raised under the glare of fame assert his own will was a mixture of pride and fear.
He has been used and abused, and all they care about is Brand Beckham.
She wanted Brooklyn Beckham to succeed, but not at the cost of the family unity she had spent years cultivating. Nicola Peltz found herself in a precarious position. Torn between supporting Brooklyn Beckham and navigating the subtle but relentless scrutiny from his parents, she became both confidant and mediator, absorbing the emotional weight while trying to maintain her own relationship with him. Every family event became a minefield: birthdays, holidays, and casual dinners layered with tension, unspoken rules. And the constant question of how much control to exert, how much freedom to allow, and how to preserve appearances while private fractures grew. Brooklyn Beckham began asserting choices that challenged the family's rhythm, small acts at first, the selection of photographers, the timing of social media posts.
They sold their wedding. They sold all the stories of their children's pregnancies. Essentially, to some degree, he is right. He has been commodified all his life, Brooklyn Beckham.
And the people he allowed close, each decision rippling outward, creating silent conflicts that simmered beneath the surface. David Beckham and Victoria Beckham were forced to confront the limits of authority, realizing that the family brand, carefully curated for decades, could not contain a son determined to forge his own identity, the siblings observed quietly, absorbing lessons in negotiation, power, and restraint, Romeo and Cruz sensing the tension without fully understanding.
Everything that is in Brooklyn Beckham's Instagram post are actually things we already know.
Their young eyes noticing that sometimes loyalty was complicated and that love did not always make conflict disappear. Brooklyn Beckham's marriage to Nicola Peltz added another layer of complexity. Her presence a stabilizing force for him, but also a subtle challenge to parental influence, each decision now a negotiation between past loyalty and present devotion. Public exposure amplified everything. Paparazzi photos, social media commentary, and gossip articles acted like accelerants on a slow-burning fire, each headline a reminder that family privacy was no longer attainable. Brooklyn Beckham's frustration sometimes spilled into social media, carefully curated statements hinting at stress, at personal struggle, at emotional boundaries being tested, and the family watched, torn between concern and the pressure to maintain the image. David Beckham tried to mediate, offering advice, support, and occasional gentle admonishment, balancing the desire to protect the family brand with the need to respect his son's autonomy.
The Beckhams will have thought that it would have been their son's bride signing the prenuptial, and in the end, it was the other way round.
Victoria Beckham navigated a more delicate path, her guidance often subtle, expressed in small gestures, in private conversations, in restrained emotional expressions, understanding that overt control could push Brooklyn Beckham further away. The conflict became emotional as well as practical. Decisions about travel, career, social interactions, and public appearances now layered with tension, every choice carrying implications for both loyalty and reputation. Brooklyn Beckham and Nicola Peltz began establishing their own routines, small rituals that created emotional space, asserting independence while still negotiating the boundaries of parental expectation. David Beckham's frustration grew, a combination of protective instinct and concern for the public image. And Victoria Beckham wrestled with guilt, wondering whether she had failed to guide, or whether she was simply witnessing a natural evolution. The emotional strain extended beyond the family core, affecting extended relationships, friendships, and professional alliances. Each interaction scrutinized, each word weighed for impact. Brooklyn Beckham's struggle was a microcosm of larger issues, a collision of fame, family, love, and identity, and every decision became a marker, a signal, a negotiation between the past and the life he wanted to build. The tension reached a point where private conversations could no longer resolve the fractures, and small disagreements escalated into public speculation, the family brand now vulnerable to misinterpretation and rumor. As David Beckham and Victoria Beckham tried to reconcile the family image with the private reality, Brooklyn Beckham's choices highlighted the delicate balance between autonomy and obligation. Between love and independence, the questions hung in the air. How much control could parents exert over a grown child? How much freedom could his son claim without alienating his family? And how long could the Beckham family maintain the illusion of perfection when internal fractures were growing too visible to contain? And as the world watched, the next moves would either heal the rift or deepen it further, leaving everyone to wonder how much loyalty, love, and patience a family could endure before the cracks became unmanageable. The aftermath of Brooklyn Beckham's statement sent shockwaves through the Beckham family, leaving every relationship altered, every trust tested, every dynamic recalibrated. David